Constantine I was anything but an ordinary Roman emperor, not for the empire and certainly not for Christianity. The Eastern Church goes as far as to recognize the monarch as a saint. His veneration is almost as great in the West. He is often regarded as the first Christian on the throne. Countless, more or less funny memes on the internet alone testify to how important he is for believers even in our time. The significance of Constantine for the Christian churches is often discussed with surprising and, to be honest, concerning extremism. Even without these circumstances, several crucial points need clarification before engaging in a meaningful discussion about his importance for Christianity makes sense. The foremost question is whether Constantine I was truly a Christian. Before we begin to search for an answer together, I must make a few personal remarks. I have a kind of special relationship with this Roman emperor. I studied history in Trier. The city served as his capital for several years. I was a museum guide at a large museum exhibition dedicated to him. It was one of the best jobs of my life. I also worked as a city guide in Trier. It was really special for me to linger in places like the Porta Nigra for a few seconds and think about the fact that Constantine may have already stood in the identical place. For me, such moments are the ones where I am as closely connected as possible to history. One of my favorite buildings is the Basilica of Constantine. In his time, this was a reception hall with a throne. Today it is a Protestant church. This photo shows very nicely that the windows in the apse are smaller than the ones in the side wall. In the basilica itself, this is no longer so clearly recognizable. This trick makes the building appear longer. The coffered ceiling has been reconstructed according to the Roman model. Each of the squares measures 3 times 3 meters. The sound remains in the room for 7 seconds. Some of the city guides sing in the basilica to demonstrate this. Anyone who has the chance to visit the city should see for themselves. But I now live several hundred kilometers away. Unfortunately, I can't do the tour myself. During the exhibition, we had a one-to-one copy of the head of his colossal statue, the original of which is in the Capitoline Museum in Rome. At that time, I was the guide for a lot of school classes. It was always the same. Some students were interested, but others were way too cool to like anything in the museum. Until they stood in front of the emperor's head. I didn't lead a single group that wasn't impressed. I tell all this to make it clear that I don't just have a bad opinion of Constantine. However, his story is highly glorified. For example, I have deliberately put his appellation, the Great, in quotation marks. I may make another video at some point to talk in detail about the unscrupulous power politician he also was. For today, it is not up to me to make an ultimate judgment as to whether Constantine was a Christian or not. I will leave this decision to you. To do this, I try to explain the arguments for and against as objectively as possible. It is likely that you might disagree several times, especially because I also have a chapter in this video that discusses some neutral points, at least in my eyes. I can only ask you to believe me that this is not meant maliciously. At the end, I present an approach from a well-known German Constantine biographer to answer the question of whether he was a Christian. I didn't completely agree with it, but I still think it's an exciting idea. This concept bids farewell to the black and white in which Constantine is often seen and focuses on the human being. Most of Constantine's life has been handed down to us through Eusebius of Nicomedia. also known as Eusebius of Caesarea. And this is a problem since the man was an Arian bishop who also knew the emperor personally. The cleric wrote a heroic tale that was to serve as a model for future rulers of how they would rule righteously in a Christian way. To this day, this heroic story is almost unchanged from is the one that is widespread in popular culture and propagated by the churches. After the death of his father, Constantine was proclaimed one of the emperors of the West by his father's soldiers. At that time, the empire was divided into 4 parts. East and West each had a supreme emperor called Augustus and a co-emperor who was called Caesar. In the system of the so-called tetrarchy, co-emperors were to ascend to supreme emperors after 10 years and appoint new co-emperors. Or to put it another way, being proclaimed by soldiers was not a legal way to come to power. Constantine therefore had to fight for his recognition in the West. His opponent was Maxentius, who had also been illegally proclaimed. Just like Constantine, he was the son of a previous Western emperor. The 2 men were brothers-in-law. Constantine had married Maxentius' younger sister Fausta. The marriage was not exactly happy, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. Maxentius saw himself as a traditional Roman emperor. Rome was his residence, where he commissioned monumental buildings. He adhered to the traditional Roman belief in polytheism. At the gates of the Eternal City, he wanted to eliminate his rival Constantine once and for all in 312. Constantine led his army south and, according to Eusebius, had visions of Jesus Christ. He showed the emperor the symbol of his religion and promised, "In this sign you will win." Constantine obeyed this divine intervention. On October 28, 312, his army lined up at the gates of Rome and allegedly carried the symbol of the Christians on the main army flag. God was to be with Constantine and his men. Maxentius stormed towards Constantine over the Milvian Bridge, which served as a passage to Rome on the Via Flamina. It collapsed under the weight of the men. Thousands of soldiers drowned. Maxentius was among them. That we have a completely different idea of what happened in modern times remains to be seen for the moment. I promise I will come back to it. Constantine is said to have subsequently turned to Christianity. A year later, he passed the so-called Edict of Milan with the Augustus of the East. It legalized Christianity. Constantine donated numerous churches to Christianity. The newly created capital, Constantinople, was to be characterized by particularly magnificent places of worship. Supposedly, the emperor also banned pagan practices, but this was already refuted by contemporaries. For example, the pagan orator Libanius spoke of the fact that Constantine had confiscated some goods from non-Christians, but had not restricted cult acts. Today, the thesis that Constantine rejected particularly bloody sacrifices and forbade them within the imperial institutions, but nothing more, is widely accepted. There are 3 ways in which a person can become a Christian. First, the person in question has been baptized. Second, the person publicly professes Christianity. Third, the person leads a life that makes it clear that he considers himself part of Christianity even without a known baptism or a public declaration. For most of Constantine's life, options 1 and 2 are out of the question. Even the church fathers of late antiquity agree that Constantine was only baptized on his deathbed. It is doubtful whether this is true at all. It is Eusebius who gives us this information. He claims to have performed the baptism himself in May 337. And it was very useful for his reputation to claim this, to put it mildly. Eusebius gives us these words of the emperor for his desire to be baptized. The time has arrived, which I have long hoped for, with an earnest desire and prayer might obtain the salvation of God, that the hour is come in which I too may have the blessing of that seal which confers immortality, the hour in which I may receive the seal of salvation. The Church Fathers explained the late baptism of Constantine by the fact that as emperor he had to make harsh decisions that were considered sins. In order not to jeopardize the effect of baptism, he had therefore only professed Christianity in this way on his deathbed. There is no known previous statement by Constantine by which he communicated his affiliation with Christianity. On the contrary, in 334 or 335, Constantine allowed the city of Hisbellum to build a temple dedicated to his family. The only thing that was forbidden were sacrifices dedicated to him. We also know nothing about any discrimination against pagan officials. The only open question is whether he had led a life that would leave no doubt about his affiliation with Christianity. This requires a differentiated view, since human lives are not one-dimensional but the result of complex decisions and conflicting motivations. Let's start with the arguments for living as a Christian. I have already mentioned the Edict of Milan and legalized Christianity and thus put it on an equal footing with other religious cults. This was a big step after the persecutions, which had recently escalated again under Diocletian. Christians made up 5 to 10% of the population. They were more strongly represented in the east than in the west of the empire. Although they were a minority, they henceforth had an extremely strong advocate at their side. Constantine, for example, gave them back extensive possessions. Modern historical research, by the way, has abandoned the concept of an edict that was passed in Milan. There is now talk of the Milan Agreement to make it clear that the two emperors did not create any new laws here, but only consented to some points. Numerous churches can be traced back to the emperor. To name just a few examples, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Cathedral of Trier, as the largest place of worship north of the Alps, or the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem are prominent examples of a very long list. Although he also promoted other building projects such as the Imperial Baths in Trier, the Christian houses of worship stood out in Constantine's role as builder. Perhaps the most important of the churches donated by Constantine is the Lateran Basilica in Rome. It is still the city's episcopal church today. Excavations have confirmed that work began as early as 312, i.e. immediately after Constantine's triumph on the Milvian Bridge. The basilica stood not only between a group of pagan temples, but also close to the palace of Constantine's mother Helena, which continues to exist today in the form of the Basilica of Santa Croce. Constantine's mother Helena, for her part, is said to have converted to Christianity in 312. She donated her palace in Trier to the local Christian community to build a cathedral, so she was already committed to Christianity before she found the Holy Cross in 326 and the Holy Robe. Reports about these legendary finds also go back to Christian historians. The religious change of his mother, who is venerated as a saint today in both Western and Eastern Europe, could also have converted Constantine to Christianity. According to this, the emperor may not have had a vision, but was convinced by Helena. Despite the temple in Hisbellum, Constantine distanced himself more and more from pagan cults in the course of his life. From 325 onwards, for example, there are no more coins that show him as a pagan god. In the institutions of the empire, such as its palaces, pagan elements were reduced more and more. In the army, he not only banned the practice of sacrifice but also introduced Sunday prayers. Constantine made Sunday a holiday and granted bishops judicial powers. Christian clerics were also granted tax exemptions. As emperor, Constantine was able to privilege religions not only legally and economically, but also through his time. As Pontifex Maximus, he was required to be a leading and caring figure for all cults in the empire in equal measure. After achieving autocracy, however, he increasingly devoted himself to Christianity. He not only presided over the Council of Nicaea as a layman, but also had Christian heretics persecuted. Christianity enjoyed his special attention. I know that this list lacks some points that are mentioned elsewhere as evidence for the Christian Constantine. I haven't forgotten them. Before we talk about them, however, we should first talk about the counter-arguments. Constantine was a follower of the sun god Sol Invictus until 312. One of the visions attributed to him in the run-up to the Milvian Bridge could have been as early as 310 in the Vosges. It was actually about the sun god. Years later it was reinterpreted as Christian with the help of the emperor. By the way, the sentence "in this sign you will win" is also a much later invention as far as we can judge today. As a usurper, Constantine had to distance himself from the original tetrarchs in religious matters to legitimize his rule divinely. These old emperors referred primarily to Jupiter and Hercules. Sol Invictus and the Christian god therefore offered themselves as fitting alternatives. It is not without reason that Constantine allowed himself to be portrayed as a sun god even years after 312. Christianity is incompatible with belief in other gods. However, Constantine tolerated pagan cults throughout his life. They were also allowed to build temples in Constantinople. The emperor apparently saw no contradiction between polytheism and monotheism. On the Ark of Constantine, built from 312 to 315, there are ancient deities. The inscription also avoids a direct mention of Christianity and speaks only of the inspiration of a deity. It reads in an analogous translation: "For the Emperor Caesar Flavius Constantinus, the greatest, pious, fortunate Augustus, have the Senate and people of Rome, because he is inspired by divinity through the greatness of his understanding. Together with his army he freed the commonwealths at the same time from both the tyrant and his entire clique in a just armed conflict, built this ark decorated with triumphal representations." Constantine himself was not only worshipped as a god throughout his life, but also beyond. Coins from his death year, 337, for example, are preserved with the inscription Divi Constantius. Divi stands for Divus, i.e. deity Constantine. In some cases, he can also be seen veiled as Divus on the coins. The already mentioned temple for the veneration of his family underlines that he had no problems with such honors. The Divus elevation also took place for some undoubtedly Christian emperors after him. The Roman tradition was apparently too important in this respect. In 326, Constantine also had extensive political purges carried out. Numerous family members were murdered. Among the victims were his wife Fausta and his son Crispus. This was unquestionably not Christian, but illustrates what a nefarious power politician the emperor could be. Constantine also stood up for the Jews, with whom the Christians competed. Even so, he probably prevented a new temple from being built in Jerusalem and made conversions to Judaism more difficult. He still left them all the privileges they had always had. For example, according to an imperial decree of 321, Jews were allowed to enter urban offices. But the Jews are also an example of the fact that Constantine did not always follow a uniform line. The neutral or not assignable points tie in with this. The Council of Nicaea is often cited to refer to Constantine's Christianity. However, for two reasons already outlined, this is not clear-cut. First, he participated explicitly as a layman. Secondly, as Pontifex Maximus of the Empire, he was obliged to mediate in religious disputes. The fact that a groundbreaking council for Christianity was held right now had a lot to do with the fact that the religion had only been legal for a few years and that the empire had only had a single ruler for a year. All this does not rule out the possibility that Constantine felt a special obligation to Christianity, but it also doesn't prove this. The founding of Constantinople is often praised as the creation of a Christian capital. However, it is not quite that simple. Firstly, it was Roman tradition to build victory cities after great triumphs. Constantine was no exception to this rule. Secondly, he also allowed pagan buildings, as already mentioned. On the other hand, churches and Christians in Constantinople far surpassed the pagan buildings and the pagan part of the population. According to the historian Heinrich Schlange-Schöningen, Constantine himself held church services and also preached. In letters from Christian clerics, he is said to have been referred to as Christians. These salutations to the emperor depended on whom he spoke to. His soldiers greeted Constantine until the end with, "May the gods protect you." This did not bother him so much that he had changed it. No event stands for the Christian Constantine as much as the battle at the Milvian Bridge. But there was probably no battle in the true sense of the word. The real bridge had already been destroyed by Maxentius' troops before the day of the final confrontation to prevent it from serving as a route to Rome. Maxentius had a support bridge built for his troops. His battle plan was that Constantine's vanguard would make a breakthrough in order for Maxentius to be able to encircle his enemy's army. However, the necessary retreat maneuver created panic in his ranks. There was a disorderly escape. Maxentius had remained in Rome until then, but now he hurried out with the guard to restore order. He was seized by the confusion and the misfortune took its course. It is very unlikely that Constantine's army bore the sign of Christianity. The army was pagan, as the previous section had already underlined. In the West, the persecution of Christians was intense. It is far from unlikely that several of Constantine's soldiers were involved. The construction of the Lateran Basilica proves that Constantine was willing to help the Christians. The victory at the Milvian Bridge may therefore have been reinterpreted for propaganda purposes to legitimize the step. But even this would not rule out the possibility that Constantine was indeed a Christian and not only wanted to help them. This brings us to the end and the announced concept of Constantine's biographer Hartwin Brandt. He speaks of a Christianity light in connection with the emperor. What he means by this is that Constantine was convinced that he had been in the favor of a deity and in the course of his life moved more and more towards Christianity without completely deciding to do so. I find it difficult to reconcile this with his tolerance of pagan cults, but I like that it makes clear that Constantine maybe was unsure about his religion himself. Yeah, now it's your turn to form your judgment. And while you do that, please, if you liked the video, please like and subscribe, because it really helps a lot. Thanks, bye!